I wonder if the map consciousness, trans consciousness process is a different biorhythm. And I've already talked about that. I was thinking about how if a person's attending lectures all day and using the brain in an intellectual way, by the end of the day the brain gets tired and it's hard to perceive and absorb more information. And I feel like in map consciousness, a person actually goes into vision, into seeing, and actually using their whole brain. And it's a different learning process than the one that we're used to through education. And the brain can exist in that state, seeing and learning in that way, without having to sit in a classroom to say I'm being educated, but actually be in life and being in the process of learning and seeing and perceiving. But after a month or a couple weeks or 2 months, the brain gets tired, just like it gets tired after 6 hours in a lecture hall chair. It gets tired after 2 months in map consciousness, in a different way of perceiving. And it lasts longer because it's a different biorhythm altogether. It's almost like waking up from the sleep of the ego, which blinds us to the 50%. So it's another waking up, it's another biorhythm. And it's also a learning process. And in that way, the brain gets tired. So the brain learns and learns and learns, and then it goes through the mania and then into the psychosis, which is just mania good, psychosis bad. But there's an entire rich spectrum of everywhere, all in between, in that good and bad. Mania is not just good or just extreme elation. It's a whole spectrum. It's a whole diverse repertoire of things that arise moment to moment and learning from that. And then psychosis is almost when the brain is starting to get tired. And so in a way, it's just a different biorhythm. It's waking up beyond our normal so-called waking state, which is mostly being blinded by our own projections. And when we're no longer blinded by our own projections, which is the past, which prevents us from learning, we're actually learning, we're actually seeing, but then the brain gets tired. And I was thinking about how these last 4 days I haven't been sleeping as well, and my brain is a bit tired, it feels like. And so I had this insight that maybe seeing in this way and extrapolating in this way gets tiring for the brain. And when the brain gets tired, often it goes into psychosis in this process. So even a person who's sleep deprived, who doesn't have a mental health diagnosis, might start hallucinating when the brain is tired. So I'm seeing this now, that it kind of makes sense that the brain gets tired when it comes to psychosis. And the interesting part too about map consciousness is some people sleep like 2 hours a night or don't sleep for days because the brain is so awake and it's not used to being that awake and perceptive. And it could be awake for 5 days, and then it could be awake for 2 months but sleep 2 hours a night, but it's just more awake, it's more perceptive, and it's learning and it's growing. And so when the brain is growing, it has trouble sleeping. But when it's sort of reached that place where it can't really grow anymore, it goes through this process of coming back down from that super awake state back down to the prevailing level of consciousness. And that super awake state creates brain cells of super awakeness. And if more people had those brain cells, we'd be able to perceive in that way and all exist in that way. But we don't. So our brains come back down, just like a balloon slowly releasing its helium. And perhaps that's part of it. There's less oxygen in the brain. It can't be oxygenated as much anymore. So it starts coming back down. It starts to hallucinate, just like somebody who doesn't have any kind of diagnosis. If they stay up for 3-4 days, they're going to start hallucinating because the brain is tired. So in the same way that we work out our muscles and they eventually get tired and we need to rest, we can't work them out indefinitely. the brain can't necessarily work out as being awake in that other way and that other mode of consciousness indefinitely. One day when our brains are all that way, we won't necessarily have to go back down to awake sleep. We won't have to have half of our brain sleeping in order to actually get through the day. And we probably just don't really know the rules of being able to sustain the brain in that awake state. And then so when we go into that hyper awake state, we come down. If we don't actually build in some of those networks in between through making meaning and dialoguing about the experience, then we're just left with the very faint blueprint of the process itself. That would be like saying, because we know how to do one curl for our bicep, the bicep's going to get strong. We have the blueprint for it, we know how to do it, but we actually have to do those motions in order for it to get strong. So map consciousness gives us a blueprint. It's like the training. It's like, this is how you do an arm curl. But then it's up to us to be like, oh, I remember that. I was sort of taught that. We have a teacher within us. All those chemicals like oxytocin, DMT, all these other flow chemicals can be released within us by some way and means. And then we have that inner teacher, we have that inner wisdom, and we're moving about reality in a different way, creating different neural connections. But then when we come back to sleeping awake, regular ego consciousness, we need to embody that which we were given the blueprint for. We get so excited about working out to build our body, and we don't think about all the degrees of freedom that we have to move about this reality to create our brains. And I think part of it too is that so much energy is going to the prefrontal cortex in terms of that noise. When it gets diverted to the whole brain, the whole being is way more awake, and we're getting more oxygen to the entire brain. We're creating new brain cells, and then eventually we get caught back into ego consciousness, awake sleep. And it might not be that that's bad. It might actually be completely necessary to have those breaks from that sort of inner space travel, and to come back into the pace of time-space, of consensus reality. But we do have the blueprint, so then the next time we go into that higher energy state, if we have been doing our practice, which is not even a practice, it's just seeing what we can see, activating our brains ourselves without having to wait for that energy to come in and do it for us. It gave us the clues, it gave us the map, it gave us the rules of the game, and they're embedded in our brains. And so really coming back down is just rest. They're always changing the rules for people that do peak performance. It's work out 5 days a week, rest 2, work out 1 day, rest 1, work out really hard, work out really slow, like they just keep changing it. And it actually could be that the point is just to keep changing it, not to actually get stuck in one thing. And so even the process of map consciousness keeps us from not changing. It changes us. It doesn't make us defective, it makes us diverse. Consciousness is trying to diversify itself. So I'm wondering, since I've been talking so much to myself, the other day I had to create my Ascended Master repellent. I might have to put Jesus on there too. Stay away, Jesus. Since that day I felt okay. I think maybe talking to myself about it helped. Maybe laughing about it helped. And and also seeing that my brain is getting tired, and maybe soon I need to rest from self-dialogue, or there's something I need to do to allow my brain to get the energy it needs. And actually I'm wondering if too much energy is being diverted to my brain and less to my body, because I went ice skating twice, and both times just totally fatigued me. And right now I'm feeling fatigued just being awake regularly. Usually I wait until I have a day of feeling kind of low to watch Netflix or something, which is like once every month or 2 or 3. I'll watch like 2 documentaries and 2 movies or whatever. But I'm thinking that putting my brain into passive mode might help divert some resources back to my body. Because the thing too is, I've gotten into states of consciousness where I do feel like I'm going to ascend. And when I feel like I'm going to ascend, I feel like I'm going to become disembodied, which translates into maybe ending my body's life. And then it's like I ascend, but then here in material life, it looks like I killed myself in some kind of horrific fashion, when really I was ascending and I was fine, but I left my body. So I would like to stay in my body, actually. And I feel like the first time I went to the hospital, I never believed I had a mental illness, but I was still okay with that interpretation because it meant I could stay in my body. And it was a way to get me really rooted again in my body, was you're this mentally ill person in this body. So maybe I want to keep that perception. For example, if I start to have distress where I'm thinking, I'm ascending, and it's feeling scary, I could take something to stop that. Like I could take Seroquel to stop that from happening. So does Seroquel stop psychosis, or does it stop ascension? And that would be interpreted as taking medication for my mental illness, whereas I interpret it as taking this chemical in order to slow my brain down. So consciousness doesn't actually leave the brain. So that's a reframe for sure. I was saying in my last video that an extrapolation came to me later, and it feels as if that is delayed extrapolation. Thought that sounded kind of funny. And I was thinking about how if we already think we're seeing, the body turns off vision. So when we have this fake seeing process of our past projections going on, the body actually turns off vision. It turns off actual seeing. And it has to, because we're projecting something into our visual field that's interfering with actually seeing. So it naturally turns off the seeing process. And then we think we see, but we only see what we think. And what we think is very limited compared to what is out there, and compared to what is in here. So we don't have access to the non-linear, we don't have access to pattern recognition if we are superimposing the linear with our past thoughts. I feel like the brain cells of map consciousness, of trans consciousness, are created like a matrix. So at first the perceptions are sort of spaced out and they're not really that connected, but it's creating this matrix of brain cells. And then as we're able to fill in all the gaps through perception and self-dialogue, other brain cells grow and strengthen that network of holistic seeing and pattern recognition. There's similar patterns throughout the universe, so once you kind of see the pattern or how the pattern patterns, you can extrapolate the patterns. But it starts with these really out there perceptions, which are usually called hallucinations and delusions, but it's really just the brain starting to fill in this diverse matrix of things, so it's not necessarily related to the present moment. And then once it fills in enough of that matrix, then we can really see the present moment, because we have this whole holistic brain that we're using instead of these few wires in the prefrontal dopamine cortex. If I have out there perceptions, I've had thousands of perceptions that are sort of within, and this is a new epimimetic and endomimetic structure that's mirrored in the brain. And then there could be ones that are slight outliers, and I can actually prune them by seeing they're not part of the pattern. Can we see what our brain is doing? When the brain is projecting tunnel vision of past ego thoughts, how can it see what it's doing? The brain is what it's doing. And right now it's being used. So our wiring is tunnel vision, no matter how we try to program ourselves. And the thing is, when we try to create new habits and programs, it's just another program. The program is trying to reprogram itself. And if we can see this programming and the nature and the structure of it, that which is seeing the program is something other than the programming. And that's the only step. Because the programming blocks seeing. And if we can see the programming, we can see. It's not about changing the programming, because it's programming that changes programming. And what we want is to be able to be free to act in the moment. I feel like the sound programming is what blinds us. So we're blinded by our own voice. It's almost like this wall of sound, of image sound, is in front of us, and we've projected it. And so this wall of sound in our own voice is what prevents perception and awe in that moment when we see and we're speechless. I feel the ego sound is what creates the blind spot. The process of seeking is blinding, because we're seeking with our programming, and the programming is telling us what to seek. And this is like saying we know what we're seeking, because it's looking for something in particular. It's looking for that which it seeks, when really what it's looking for is that by which it seeks, which is seeing itself. I feel like the ego warps our brain, and it operates at warp speed. And when we go into map consciousness or trance consciousness, we're operating at light speed. So the ego is at warp speed. It's at the speed of sound, the speed of the sound of our own voice. And when that's quiet, we can see all the light. And the light of perception is what grows the brain. Just like the light hitting the leaves of a tree give it energy through photosynthesis. The light hitting our eyes from what we're actually seeing in our visual field, when it's not blocked by the sound of our own voice, grows our brain cells. Because the chlorophyll and the leaves of the tree, the energy helps to grow the roots. So the light hitting our eyes of perception grows our brain cells. So our brain is actually photosynthetic. Photosynthesis is created by the photons of light. If we can't see something, if we can't perceive something, it can't be created in our brains. We're addicted to our own projections, which we project to block the 50%, and seeing this same thing all the time, and getting dopamine, and dopamine withdrawing, and getting dopamine. And we're so addicted to this that we can't see. We're addicted to our own blindness. We all suffer from dopamine blindness. Dopamine creates the blind spot because it's the thing we're projecting in terms of pleasure, our own thoughts and images. Creates the blind spot. We react to that. We're only reacting to our projections, and we get pleasure from our own projections. And I think that's what Dr. David Hawkins means when he said, surrender the juice. Surrender the pleasure you get from your own projections. It's like we're putting out a dopamine beacon constantly. And we can only see that beacon. We can't see the rest of what's happening. We might need to free our perception of the concept of focus. And when we can see meaning everywhere. Because we can see the intelligence of life everywhere. Life is meaning. Everything has meaning. We just can't see it because we're chasing a particular meaning. We've been told to look for something meaningful, and then we're told what that meaningful thing is. We're given hints of what it is, and so we look for that. When we aren't looking for meaning, we can see it everywhere. Because if we look for it, we're saying that we know what it is. And that narrows the field of perception. And what we really want is an expansive field of perception. So an ever arising newness of meaning can come into consciousness. Not the meaning we think is meaningful.